Hey everyone, this is Matt from Slam Sector, and you're in the pipe with 5x5, the podcast where we explore things that make wargaming so special. Today we're going to be talking about dipping your toes into competitive wargaming, specifically with 40k, with our special guest, Trevy, TacticalTortoise, through YouTube, and I imagine you're on a few other channels, right?
Yeah, I've got plenty of channels all over the place.
Fantastic, yeah. So, you're also, I imagine, like Instagram, Twitter, all that fun stuff.
Yeah, I've got it all. I'm mostly at Trevy the Great, anywhere that requires an at in it. But otherwise, you can find me on Tactical Tortoise on YouTube and Tactical Tortoise TV on Twitch. Tactical-tortoise.com gets you to my site that has all of those links on it.
Fantastic. Yeah, we're going to have all these socials plugged into the description in the video below. So just check that out. We've also got a discussion going on in Discord about all this fun stuff. So you can jump in there as well. So yeah, let's just dive right into it. I guess to get started and kind of to get context for the whole thing, Trevy, how did you personally get into Warhammer, and then what was your path into competitive Warhammer?
Yeah, so I was, I think, started down the dark path from an early age. My dad was really into model trains, which is, I imagine, a common gateway drug for a lot of people getting into like the more esoteric corners of doing miniature stuff. So I was always in and around, miniatures and modeling and things like that. And at one point near me in my local mall, a Games Workshop store opened, and the rest, they say, is history. We got in with the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game, the old classic. My dad, being kind of a closet, nerd from the 70s, was a real big Lord of the Rings fan. So as those movies were releasing and they were coming out with kits for it, he was head over heels, and he liked the miniatures more. He was more about modeling, and I liked playing the games and making lists and stuff. And that sort of evolved into all of the other miniature games.
Right, for sure. What was the first army that you really sunk your first coin into from that store?
So I mean, we played with Lord of the Rings like everything. That was kind of the modus operandi for Lord of the Rings was you picked like either good or evil, and you just played whatever you wanted.
Nice. Okay.
I played Lizardmen in Warhammer Fantasy. That was like one of my first loves. And in Warhammer 40k, my first army was actually Tau, but I very quickly picked up Tyranids and basically didn't look back from there.
That's fair. Yeah. Very cool, man. So yeah, what were some of your first inklings towards the tournament scene or the competitive arena?
That's actually an interesting question, because I don't think I'd ever gotten into Warhammer to play competitively. My first competitive game, and I think a lot of people have the same experience, is actually War Machine and Hordes. So I took a little bit of a hiatus from Warhammer when I was in college, and some locals sort of during and after college had picked up War Machine as it was in its Mark II release and kind of in its heyday at that point. And that game's very focused on competitive play, and that was usually how you got most of your games in. Whereas Warhammer, you would go to the game club or whatever and have a game day, and you would play 2 or 3 games. The same experience in War Machine was going to a steamroller, which is what they called their Rogue Trader tournaments, basically. So I think that I hopped into playing games competitively in War Machine, and the caliber of games and just the sort of experience you have of playing a game where you and your opponent are both trying to win, and it really becomes a battle of wits, was really energizing, and I really enjoyed that. So when I eventually made the trek back to 40k years later, that was really the only kind of arena that I was interested in engaging with. And fortunately, Warhammer 40k has a huge competitive scene, so that was really easy to slot into.
That's awesome. That's really cool. What edition in Warhammer did you come back into?
So I initially played a little bit of 3rd, and then sort of jumped to 4th and 5th. The 6th edition release was a nightmare. That was sort of when I dropped out. But then coming back in most recently was about halfway through 8th edition. So I remember distinctly being just a couple months or maybe even weeks before the 8th edition Space Marine release, which kind of turned the game on its head.
Yeah, no, I believe it because, I got into 8th edition myself after a few false starts. Actually, one of my false starts was like I first discovered 40k in 6th edition, and then I was like, whoa, this seems really cool. Like I'm actually, like looking up the lore and everything, and that was fine. And the books were a lot of fun. But whenever I would read it on the forums, it was just like the nightmare of 6th edition. I was like, oh no. Everyone hates this game, so
yeah.
it was a poor intro for me. And then I came back around in 8th edition. I was like, oh man, I guess I cleaned everything up, huh?
Yeah, 6 was it was a wild time because 5th was very. I think generally speaking, the common thought was that 5th was like really tidy and very clean. Like, the mechanics were, nothing was like super complicated, and there weren't like resource mechanics, there weren't command points and stratagems and stuff like that. So it was kind of shallow, but like everything was laid out very, very, very well. And it very much became kind of a chess match of a game. And then 6th edition like introduced things like Overwatch and random charges, but didn't like change any other core mechanics. So if you were playing a melee army, I remember I played Tyranids at the time, so I played my one game of 6th edition, and my unit that would have been in charge range in 5th edition failed its charge and then got shot, and half of them died. I was like, this game. It's not very
good. Yeah. No, it sounds like it definitely struggles. Yeah. Well, hey, I later on in the dialogue, I kind of want to get into the evolution of Warhammer, kind of as a competitive item, but kind of like earlier, in what I want to broach on is kind of like that transition that we were talking about, where, you kind of get into it with the newbie and the casual mindset, and then what, elements or let's say, mental attitudes are helpful when trying to shift into the competitive element. If that's way too esoteric, we can chop it up into different pieces.
Yeah, I think I got you. Yeah,
okay.
Just transitioning over between playing casually and playing competitively, and I think that there is a little bit of a misconception that it is like kind of a wholly different game. Whether you're playing casually or competitively, and to some extent it is. But I think that people playing casually or just playing with their friends or interacting with the game on kind of a very base level where you go to the game store once a month or whatever, and you play the units that you like, and maybe they're good and maybe they're bad, and then the next week you want to switch something up and you take a different unit. That is not so different from playing the game competitively. And I think that you'll find that anytime someone is analyzing their gameplay and thinking about how their list worked, I would struggle to find a single player of any sort of one versus one style of game who wasn't at some level trying to improve their gameplay. And that's sort of that's the gateway, I think, between the casual and competitive play. And it's just that, when you're playing competitively and you're playing to win, you kind of you do that to a more dramatic extent, but the same reflexes are still there, where you're thinking very critically about the games that you played and about the units in your army and stuff like that. So I think the first thing to consider is that it's not like it's going into an entirely different game with a different system, and you have to rethink your every move that you make. It is still 40k, and it's going to feel very similar. It's just that I think, generally speaking, like the power level of both you and your opponent's lists tends to be a little bit higher because you're incentivized to take kind of more optimal things.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So, go ahead.
Yeah. So, speaking of optimal things and everything, some mindsets that I've kind of picked up from people that are kind of getting into the more competitive elements is that they'll read those like Monday metas or whatever or something, or like Goonhammer will post an article kind of going over the weekend's tournament brackets and everything, and it seems really restrictive in what an army can do. You know what I mean? Where okay, if I if I'm playing demons, then I got to make sure I'm bringing, the Lord of Change and the Bloodthirster with the specific relic and everything. How much flexibility is there really? Because in my personal experience, like I've only got a few limited experiences with RTTs, but the local meta is fundamentally drastically different from what I read about on like Goonhammer. You know what I mean? Yeah. So, those, I guess list building, barriers that can be artificially put up by, the internet discussed meta at large. How, much do you feel that's actually there versus the perception of it being there?
Yeah, I think that's a super good discussion to have. And I think that's one thing that I would like to impress upon people, especially if they're trying to get in, they're just trying to break into the competitive game. And they're going to go to an RTT, or they're going to go, at their local, play with their local gaming team or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to impress on people that number crunching is only really useful in either a situation where you are at the cutting edge of competition. So if you are like undefeated at LVO championships or something like that, then this discussion of which faction's better and the minutia of your warlord trait picks and your relics and things like that like does become a big consideration. And also in the grand scheme, if you're pulling back the scope of the discussion and you're talking about the math of the game in its entirety, then looking at these like faction win rates and trends and stuff like that, that's also very useful. But when you're just jumping into the competitive side of the game, that's not really the arena that you're participating in. The thing to keep in mind is the game in front of you, and you'll find very quickly that not only are those trends and opinions and pieces of technology not always entirely true, and especially in a local meta game or in a specific situation in the game that you're playing in, but also it's a good thing to kind of pull them out of your mind, because you can often find yourself falling into these situations where you overanalyze and start to assume outcomes of situations or of games, and that is a recipe for disaster right there. So I think that playing the units that you are the most comfortable with, and if you have a question about what units would improve your army, or what you think other people should, or what other people are recommending you take, then I think looking at those other lists are definitely a useful tool. But when it comes to, should my faction beat your faction, or is this character, should I take this character 100% of the time over this other character, something like that, that honestly doesn't really matter so much. And I think you're going to burn yourself out, is sort of thinking about it too hard versus just trying to win, the game in the situation that you come into.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, all the super matchups and everything, really all you've got to worry about, an RTT is just 3, right? And the ones that I played have only been 3 games. Yeah. You just have to worry about those 3 opponents, basically.
Right. It's 3 games, and especially if you're not in a huge community, like oftentimes, we have to worry about Astra Militarum right now is like a good example. If they can shoot you, they're just going to shoot you off the table. But if nobody in your local community plays Astra Militarum, that doesn't matter, right? So building for that matchup, or trying to take it into account, or getting stressed about it, right? Like it doesn't make a difference. And then even if there is an Astra Militarum player in a group of 16 or something, the chance that you run into them is very low. So
good point.
And then in that situation as well, we are blessed to exist in an edition of 40k where in the grand scheme of things, the result of a game is not predetermined by the matchups that hit the table. And I think that there have been certainly situations in 40k and meta games and rule sets where one army just defeats everything, or one army beats one other army 100% of the time. But that's not how 9th edition 40k works at this stage. And so, if your opponent messes up, you can beat them. So I think the number one determiner is player skill. And from there, The tiebreaker may be your faction selection or those, that technology or those pieces of war gear and stuff like that. But generally speaking, you can find that. There's a lot of people who pick up meta armies who have no idea how to use them, and you can roll those people over, no problem.
That's a good point. Yeah, you have to know how to pilot the engine. Mm-hmm. It's not only just making the big eBay purchase, but you have to actually know how the overlapping buffs and everything work.
In fact, I think this may not have been the case for 40k in the past, but Warhammer right now is very complicated, especially with every faction having stratagems and aura abilities and command phase abilities and secondary objectives and all these things. And I think that there is a case to be made that person who goes out and looks for the meta army and gets the latest thing that's really broken or whatever is actually at a disadvantage compared to the person who knows their codex back to front. They know how to respond with the units that they're playing in every situation. And they have a mastery of the tools in their toolbox that will get them out of these situations that a player who's brand new to an army, who just picked up an army because they thought it was really good, isn't going to have, and is going to actually struggle, hitting new situations with an army like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So, you would say that then, especially in local metas or for smaller population tournaments, the old adage of any army piloted correctly could beat any other army, kind of depending on skill, especially in this environment with 40k, you would say?
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, I mean, skill, there's a little bit of luck involved sometimes. Sometimes you have to get good matchups. Sometimes you have to just dice your opponent. But that's the beauty of a dice game, is that, in a lot of situations, even though you feel like you're losing the game, your opponent could just roll a bunch of ones in a row, and suddenly you're back into it, and that can happen. And if they haven't piloted well enough to get a dominating lead at that point, then suddenly the ball's back in your court and you have a chance. So
that's a good point.
Even if you look down, not a lot of places cover things like RTT wins, but if you look down on like Best Coast pairings or something, if you're a subscriber, you can look at lists from every single event that uses Best Coast pairings. And you look over the course of a weekend, you'll see that there's trends where the factions that are good will win more often. But basically every faction gets represented at that 3-0 level. Just by virtue of the fact that they played well and they were able to get some solid matchups.
Yeah, awesome. That's really good stuff. So you mentioned earlier, like, getting into the dice math and having these expectations of outcomes, right? When at the end of the day, it's a dice game, you got to go through the entire dice funnel to actually get these results. What's in the math hammer isn't exactly what's in the dice box, right? What are some other...
The math hammer usually gives you average results, but that only means that it's in the middle of the high and the low, which means both the high and the low are possibilities at any one time.
I've always thought that those like stats about like this is the average damage, it needs to come with like a wave chart or like a heat map of like, okay, well, like how extreme is that variation, just to kind of reiterate that point.
Yeah, oftentimes you find people even complaining about units that have like a very high average damage. You can look at something like a rail gun, right? Where the average damage from the single attack is like 11, and it's this huge number. But then you have a lot of people who just despise that weapon and think it's hot garbage. And a lot of the reason for that is that it ends up being a single attack. So either that is an average damage, but the average comes between 0 and wherever your attack's converted into. So you'll find that people oftentimes don't even play consistently with whatever the average damage is, because they value dice consistency more than these weapons that could potentially do tons and tons of damage to your opponent's army.
Yeah, it's a fascinating expectation versus reality situation for sure. Yeah, so I would describe that as one common pitfall for like a new or, like fledgling competitive player. Some other competitive pitfalls that I've experienced or my buddies and I have talked about is like, we're always like when the chess clock comes out, it's almost like like a gavel going off in a courtroom. It's like, oh my god, the chess clock. So it feels intimidating. But I'll be honest with you, like I've kind of forced myself a few times with the chess clock. And it's kind of a liberating experience, man. It's just like, I don't have time to sit here and think about this all day. It goes on. For some reason, the chess clock stands out for me just anecdotally. But what are some other like traps or pitfalls or like snag points that you see for new competitive players?
One of them that I ran into sort of when I had first started playing 40k competitively was that like, because it's called a competitive game, but that's kind of a misnomer. It's just a competition in that, like, at the end there's one winner, but that doesn't mean that it's an actual battle between you and your opponent. And so I see a lot of especially new players like come into the community right. with this preconception that it's immediately going to be contentious and that their opponent is like out to get them. And that is absolutely not the case. Like, generally speaking, you'll find very quickly that competitions, that especially at a local level, are just a way for people to go, like, hang out on a weekend and play 3 games of Warhammer. And generally speaking, the people who are there to have fun are super duper fun to play against. And there's a lot of people who just want to show off their cool armies and get some games against good stuff with janky stuff, like, as sort of a challenge to themselves. And there's also people who are extremely good, you'll also find being, incredibly generous opponents, because like they're very confident in their abilities. There's no reason for the game to be contentious. So I think there's a lot of people who come into like a tournament with their shields up, basically, where they're like ready to fight about things. And like, you don't got to do that. We're still just playing toy soldiers over here, We're just a bunch of nerds doing nerd stuff. I think that's one of them. And I also think that a big one right now, and I might be shooting myself in the foot here, but especially with like the age of content creation that we have in Warhammer, and especially competitive content creation, where there's all these people and they all have opinions and they all have numbers and stats to back up the things that they say on videos and podcasts and stuff. And like, I'll talk, basically reiterate back to the point where I said earlier, where a lot of times this over analysis leads to these preconceptions, and people will walk into a tournament with very little on table experience, but they've listened to every episode that Art of War has ever done, and so they know the best thing. You don't have to do that, and most of the time you'll find that that doesn't necessarily reflect reality. So, I mean, again, like I would leave those, whatever you consider to be like a meta rule or something at the door. You have to play the game suite that's in front of you, and you can't take things too seriously, because it's toy soldiers at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, the first RTT I played, I went 0-3, but I had a blast with it, because very quickly the vibe was, oh, this is just me paying like $20 to guarantee that I get 3 games of 40k in a day, right? And so it felt really good. It was awesome. I actually met some pretty cool people doing that opened my eyes up to some like list building stuff that I hadn't even considered before. So it was really fun. Yeah. Okay, so with competitive 40k, it's kind of like this evolving, constantly shifting situation, right? Especially with how often Games Workshop likes to do the adjustments with points and the balanced data slate and emergency fixes and all sorts of stuff like that. From where you've been monitoring it and like tracing that trajectory, do you like where it's going? Do you enjoy the season format? Because it doesn't seem like the season format was always a thing, right? It's relatively recent from what it seems. Yeah,
that's new as of 9th edition. And actually, this is the first time that Games Workshop has kind of stepped into the scene of writing competitive rule sets entirely. Because previously it was just ITC. They had their format, and like WTC had a format. And there were a couple different mission formats that you would would play in, but none of them were official in any capacity. So Ninth Edition has been the first time that Games Workshop has actually sort of sold a rule set that they made themselves with the GT format, which means that not only not only is that brand new, but also the season format's brand new. And I do think that it is good. It's good for the game in general because the most important thing that it does, first of all, it rotates the rule set, which is good. Because especially if you're engaging with 40k on a consistent basis, things can get stale very quickly, especially because oftentimes armies don't have like an infinite amount of depth. So you're in a couple months or so and you played most of the stuff in your faction and you're ready for something new. And at that point, then suddenly the game changes and now you have to change your list and you have to change how you approach games. And rather than, jumping into a new army, you can now kind of get reinvigorated by looking at the game from a different angle. It also lets them fix their mistakes. So, no season of GT so far has been perfect, but they have slowly but surely been getting better and repairing some of the problems that were in previous seasons. So that's also good because Games Workshop, they're not always perfect at writing rules. And so at least this gives them an outlet every 3 to 6 months where they can fix these sort of egregious balance things, and it's even things that the community slowly but surely kind of latches onto and they uncover as the game goes on, where a secondary objective might be really easy, or a certain mission is has a strategy that you can abuse to score it really easily or something like that. And as those get uncovered, the game has a way to repair those problems. So yeah, I think the season format is pretty good. The current state is always up in the air. The biggest change right now are the data slate changes, the rebalances that they do every 3 to 6 months, and that kind of that changes the overall state of the game dramatically. And I think that's also good because it lets them rebalance things in a big way. And then...
Absolutely.
Was that?
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, and then, the future, I think the last question you asked is, what could we be looking forward to? And I would hope that kind of a greater involvement in 10th edition, which it sounds like we're rounding the corner of...
I have to imagine,
the rumors are abounding. Some wild stuff's going around right now about a potential 10th edition maybe in the second half of the year. And I would hope that this format sort of continues. I think there's certainly room to improve, but I'm crossing my fingers that they continue to represent this level of involvement that they have in 9th edition, and that the system and the delivery system for these updates gets better.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that'd be really good to see. And I think the route that they're going with the consistency is going to be reliable as it seems to have been. Something that I've noticed with certain tournaments is they'll have like TO or tournament organizer judgment calls as far as specifically like terrain placement, right? Like some of it is player placed and they have rules about like 4 inches away from the edges and the other pieces, and some of it is like preset or things like that. Have you seen any trends with that happening with terrain placement? Because Games Workshop, I think like, what was it, like a year and a half ago or whatever, they had that tournament circuit, and they had those 2 maps that some people thought was gospel and some people were like, oh yeah, no, there's no way we're doing this is way too much / too little terrain, right? So I was wondering if you had any input or opinion on that.
Yeah, terrain's a real interesting thing in 40k. Especially at the competitive level, the game can live or die on the terrain that you're playing on. Where how much line of sight blocking terrain and how much cover and how many ruins are on the table can dramatically change the interactions between factions. But with as powerful as it is, in the game, and as important as it is for maintaining, consistency and balance between all these factions, Games Workshop has never actually, included any sort of like terrain layout as part of the game itself. They have like their tournament circuit has terrain systems, which are great, but they're there only for this select number of events. And while I think the impetus is that other people are encouraged to use it, you don't have to, right? And I do think that that's a weakness of 40k. At this stage of the game, it feels a little bit late for Games Workshop to be like to try to go and mandate a terrain layout for people, because the game has existed for 30 years with people just making their own terrain and playing whatever they want, and that means that every single community has its own opinions on what terrain should look like and what the terrain rules should be, and all this stuff. I think I'm a big fan of consistency, especially between gaming groups, because that then incentivizes like cross-pollination between people playing in different formats and stuff. Like right now, if you play on the where I'm located, so I'm on the East Coast of the U.S., a lot of events are using the U.S. Open layout. So there's like a bunch of big bricks of ruins in the middle, basically, with walls on them. If you go over to the West Coast, everything over there uses the I won't say everything, but a lot of things use the player place terrain system, like you're just describing, that Frontline Gaming uses. And it is kind of problematic as you move between those two communities, because the terrain changes dramatically between those. And so I think the platonic ideal for better or worse would be for Games Workshop to just sort of, in the GT packet or something, like just tell you what the terrain layout is meant to look like. But they've never done that, and I don't think that they will. So we'll continue to have sort of this disparate, these big differences between different terrain formats. And it's important as you're going to an event to know what terrain you're playing on, and at least, mark it out on your table and look at it for a bit, and like see where you can place your models, where they're hidden or where they're in a good position or where they want to move to next turn. Because if you're being blindsided the first or second game with a new terrain format you've never played on, can definitely be an eye-opening experience.
Yeah. No, as someone who is tinkering with a grid and clean one, not being able to fit that sucker through two buildings is the worst feeling in the world.
Yeah, that's always just terrible, for sure. Yeah, and I do think like every terrain format has like pros and cons and strengths and weaknesses to it, and none of them that aren't just cobbled together by some game store or something are constructed without a lot of thought put into them. But again, like you said, it's knowing whether or not your models can operate on a terrain piece, or when you move around between stores, knowing what the terrain features are going to look like and where they're going to be positioned is currently kind of a weakness of playing the game competitively, I'd say.
Yeah. No, I mean, the community obviously adapts to it, and like you were saying, it almost makes like these pockets of like subculture, for lack of a better word, right? You have West Coast versus East Coast flavor.
I mean, even like traveling overseas, the terrain format starts to differ like wildly between like the WTC format at the UK tournament circuit format versus the US formats. And you'll even see, I think at LVO, which was just this past month, just a couple weeks ago, we had some incredibly strong players come from overseas and just, I think, kind of get blindsided by the player place terrain format that they were in, which is unfortunate to see. Where we had all these really, really good players, put all this time and effort into traveling, and then a lot of them lost kind of early in the tournament, I think.
That's crazy.
Largely because they maybe didn't have armies that were very customized to the terrain, and they weren't super used to the player place terrain system, and that can happen. And I think it's a big fields bads, but it's the nature of the beast currently, but hopefully it changes in the future.
Yeah, fingers crossed they're able to find some elegant, way of bridging bridging that divide. Now, actually, that made me think of something. So, I guess like local metas can shift pretty hard, like across seas and in different countries. Do you think that terrain placement is one of the reasons why everything that comes out of Australian tournaments is so like just marvelously different than anything else you see?
That is a great question. Australia is a can of worms, I think, both as a 40k community and as an actual country, as far as I know.
For sure. Yeah.
I think the terrain likely has something to do with it. I don't know exactly what their terrain looks like and whether or not there is like a consistent format in the Australian circuit. But also I think that it's kind of like it's a little bit of a small pond. The biggest events there are maybe 100, maybe to 200 players, which where you compare it to like Las Vegas Open, which is 1,000 players, is a little bit smaller.
Yeah.
Which means that the skill of the players at the top of the metagame tends to be kind of more impactful because they, you tend to see like kind of a similar among the top players in any particular community of a large enough size. The skill of the top players tends to be relatively consistent, which means that if they're fighting through like a smaller pool of people at the lower levels, then you can kind of get away with playing sort of more out there stuff. Okay. And because the skill is so much different between you and your opponent, you end up being I think a little bit more advantage to win overall, like sort of over the course of a larger event. But certainly, I don't think it's that like the Australian like meta is bad or something, and like their players don't know what they're doing, because clearly that's not the case. Going back to LVO, we just saw the Australian circuit championship. The champion almost went all the way at LVO. So, like, I think that the player skill is certainly there, and I think that they're just sort of utilizing that player skill to focus on more esoteric selections rather than kind of trying to solve the metagame, which I think is what a lot of people at the very cutting edge of things in larger formats will tend to do, or larger circuits will tend to do.
That's a good point. Yeah, if you have no idea what Wombo Combo they're bringing that they've home brewed, you don't know what to expect versus the army that you've been reading about for 3 weeks that sits in front of you. You're like, okay, let me go for this weak spot that it has.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that is another like that's a good point. Talking about how like where the skill matters more in a competitive setting. That is a good example of that, where you can have an army that your opponent might have thought about a lot. If you have a real meta army and your opponent's built for it, and they've gotten the latest hot tips from their favorite content creator on how to beat whatever the army of the month is. But you come out of the woodwork with some wild stuff. They're unprepared. There's no way that your I don't know, like Grot tank spam has been accounted for in the meta. You can pick up some wins from that for sure, especially if you're building on like factions or sub factions that are very rarely seen, and so you may have tools up your sleeve that your opponent's not like.
That's
not
a good point. Of. Yeah, go for the deep cuts and make them check the rule book.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, are you serious? That stratagem works that way? Oh my god! How come nobody's playing this? That's the response you want to get.
That's a very good feeling. Yeah. So something else that was very interesting, like it was probably a few months back now. It was when the Votann Codex was coming out. As someone that like has barely put like an ankle deep into the competitive water, watching the discussions and tournaments kind of talk about if they should allow the book or not. And then I think like a pretty big European tournament being like, you know what? A, this doesn't look balanced, and B, it's too close to the line. We're banning Votann, right? I think it was like a German tournament. And, that kind of, it seemed like a bit of an upset to the status quo on things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely, especially at these big events, there's always kind of a rush towards new stuff, especially stuff that hasn't had a cleanup like hot fix yet, because a lot of times
Right.
there are interactions that were unintended on, from the design standpoint, where like if you're in the faction early enough, you can kind of take advantage of before they get fixed, and that's, I think, part of the reason that there was such a discussion about that, because there were interactions within the Votann codex that were, comparatively too strong.
Gotcha.
And I think, that's just gonna be a a thing that happens in 40k. They very rarely catch everything, and so right now I think we're dealing with the Astra Militarum. There are interactions with Astra Militarum that are absolutely unintended, where effects can stack upon, like, on each other, where you have like same name effects that are doing the same thing, or you can you can do like 16 and a half mortal wounds with a Kazarkin unit, stuff. There's all this stuff.
Right. Yeah.
And it's just kind of part of the nature of the beast of 40k, and I think there's a couple ways that you can approach it. To some extent, I think that extending cutoffs for rules, so that rules that are released, after a certain point, is probably the way to sort of avoid stuff like that. And I think that there is a movement more recently, and I kind of hope it catches on, where codexes aren't being allowed in larger events until they've received at least the first FAQ pass, and so like the wording cleanup and their abilities aren't fixed and stuff like that. The other avenue you can go in, and it's a little bit more controversial, it's just to either just leave them as is, which is kind of how a lot of events have been doing things. And I'm kind of two minds on that. I think to some extent, kind of embracing the brokenness of the game, and especially in a high visibility setting where suddenly, like, people are complaining that some interaction happens and the design team is more incentivized to fix it more quickly. I think there is a benefit there.
Yeah, for sure.
But I also think that the other option is for TOs to, like, just very aggressively FAQ things and maybe disallow specific interactions within a new codex, which requires a lot more work and also becomes a lot more kind of arbitrary. Where one TO may enjoy this kind of interaction and one TO may think it's broken, and so you start to get this divergence of the format between different events. And again, I'm a fan of consistency, so I think that however the community wants to take issues like that, I would hope would be adopted by a wide variety of events, so that you if a codex comes out, that you probably can't play it in a GT or something for a couple weeks until after it's released. Now the Votann thing itself is interesting, because that whole kerfuffle like directly led to a day one FAQ for the codex, which we have basically never seen before. And so the
right.
messaging is pretty clear that this kind of extreme response to codexes and interactions that are, like, clearly broken, it does work. And I think that I don't know, maybe people should I'd hope that the community uses this newfound power with restraint, but also, in some situations it's certainly warranted.
Yeah, no, I mean, the fact that Games Workshop actually produced a response that fast is eye-watering, really.
Yeah.
Brings a tear to the eye.
Yeah. For sure. It's mostly kind of shocking, because they're very usually pretty tepid in their response to things. This Astra Militarum Codex has been in people's hands for like 2.5 months now, and we haven't gotten any FAQs for it. So who knows?
Yeah.
You win some,
we'll
you lose
see.
some, I guess.
I guess so. Man, that's really funny. So I noticed something else that happened, and it was. I guess this pertains more to 40k as a kind of like a gaming hobby in general, but it does have competitive implications to it. It's like the flow of rules leaks and people knowing the veracity or not of them, and being able to kind of like get like on the ground floor or even the basement on preparing for the next meta shift, right? Do you think that net hurts the game or helps keep interest in the game, right? With like all the constant leaks that are going on, because I mean, I think at time of recording, there's some insane leaks that are just like like posted by anonymous people on shady websites. It's just like, what the hell, man? Like,
there's a lot of green
I don't know.
text involved for sure.
Right. So I mean, it's fascinating, but also as someone who kind of like dips their toe in, and then I'll go to my hobby desk for a while, and then I don't consume all the media all the time with this. I'll notice like, wait, is that codex out, or is that rumor like announced yet, or have we moved on to something else? Like it's very confusing as far as like what the official timeline of game releases and everything is. I don't know. I've kind of wondered if there's a net detriment there or a net positive.
Yeah, that's an interesting discussion. I know in Magic the Gathering, they can trace rules leaks, and they're extremely diligent about leaks from playtesters and things like that. They can directly, and to be fair, the business model is a little bit different, so I don't know if it translates to Warhammer perfectly, but they can directly translate rules leaks to drops in sales from sets that have been leaked.
Fascinating.
So the further out that stuff gets spoiled for people, the less likely those people are to buy heavily into whatever new thing's coming out. Because you can kind of make sense, right? To some extent, if a new card is coming out, or for 40k, a new model in a codex, and that it's good weeks ago, then your mindset changes, and your buying habits will change to prioritize getting whatever that one thing is. Whereas if a rule set drops on you and no one knows if anything in it's good, then you're much more you're inclined to just sort of shotgun approach it, right? And get everything and try everything and just go from there. And there's not only so do you start to try to optimize your purchases if you buy things really if you have foreknowledge, but then also there's like less excitement, right? If you know everything going in before these rules drop, and there's no sort of exploratory period for them. So from a business standpoint, I think Games Workshop is incentivized to prevent these rules leaks from happening to some extent.
Right.
From a community standpoint, I think like there's always going to be a rumor mill or something, right?
Oh, sure, yeah.
that like you can't change that. I think that's just the nature of the internet. That's always going to be the case. In specifically about competitive play, it is kind of controversial because of how tightly married playtesters are to the competitive scene, where a lot of playtesters for Warhammer are also very competitive players. So the question becomes whether or not they're getting an unfair advantage from having pre-knowledge of the rules. And I think it's an interesting discussion. I think to some extent you could say, and this is how Magic the Gathering does it, where their playtest team is disincentivized from sort of sharing their knowledge around with their buddies and using it to their advantage, because they're also disallowed from playing in competitive events. So there isn't as much of an incentive there to benefit personally from their foreknowledge.
Okay,
The difference with Warhammer is that the community is like exponentially smaller. So as soon as you take the most enfranchised people in the community out, I think that there is a harmful effect on everyone else, right? Because these are also people who are content creators, who are community organizers, and so these people will suddenly become less incentivized to sort of engage with the game to a big extent. So if you say that these people can't play competitively anymore, then they're also, they're not going to want to do all the other stuff that goes alongside that. Make podcasts and make videos and run demos and stuff like that. On the flip side, I do think that I don't know exactly how Games Workshop's playtest system works, because there is also, Warhammer being as convoluted as it is, you can already see people if you play somebody who's been in Warhammer long enough, trying to remember which version of rules that they're on is actually difficult. And I hadn't really experienced this until I think mostly recently, but having to go through all of these data slate changes, I've just forgotten it to some extent. Like what, did my stratagem, is it nerfed now, or did that get removed and it was nerfed last season? How does this interaction work currently? And I do think that if the playtest process is aggressive enough, there actually might be a detriment to playing pre-release rules, because they change so often that you may end up just forgetting what your stuff does.
That's a very good point.
That's like, I'm like totally spitballing, but I have to imagine that, at some point, a person who has playtested for Warhammer has absolutely forgotten what their models have done. And if those models changed along a lot of times during the playtest process, then that's even more difficult than it already looks like it is.
Oh man, yeah, no, it's very interesting seeing the ecosystem and the community affected by these things, and the group that's who's behind the curtain and how that process is made, right?
It's like still an ongoing discussion within the community. I think the real issue, in my opinion, isn't even the people who are playtesting who are then benefiting. It's that the people who are playtesting, like, may or may not have some very flappy lips, right? And suddenly these playtest documents like spread much farther than they were intended. If it's if it's a team of 8 people or whatever who get access to these documents, I think the overall impact is very low. But if it's those people all each give it to their 8 friends, then suddenly it goes wild. And I think at that point, that's when like units start selling out, when the rumors say that they're going to be buffed or something like that, and that I think is problematic.
Yeah. Absolutely. One more thing that I thought of that is kind of fascinating, and this is because everyone's talking about currently the World Eaters Codex currently isn't out yet, right? I think it's coming out in like 48 hours or something of recording time.
That sounds right.
It's significantly smaller and trimmed down from previous codexes. Do you have an opinion on that as it compares? Do you see the streamlining as a good thing? Do you see that as, potentially like a returning to the golden era of sorts, like the 5th edition type chess maneuvering? Or is it, like the last codex before they clandestinely drop a 10th edition on us?
Yeah, I do remember. I haven't actually looked at the World Eaters Codex in its entirety yet, but I do remember looking when the points value sheet originally got leaked, and it was like, it's like 12 entries long or something. It's like really tiny. And I remember it being very small, but I don't actually, I do think that smaller codexes are better. Okay. There's like an insane, in some factions, I'll say, there's like an insane datasheet bloat in 40k, where suddenly like you get these datasheets where the design team can't possibly keep up with the like volume of profiles available to an army. And I'll very brazenly point my finger at the Space Marine Codex. It's like 100 pages too long. Space Marines have like compare Space Marines to like the Harlequins Codex, which is like, actually just like 6 models. And then like, like why are like these factions sort of like treated equally, right? And you run into problems where like there are units that are just left behind. The last time someone seriously took a Predator in a competitive game of 40k was so long ago, because like Predators, they haven't, like, their rules haven't changed in, I would imagine, since like 5th edition. They're like, they've basically just been the same unit. And they're, probably like equally as unoptimized now as they were back then. And I do think like they've been trying to make these old data sheets better with points changes and frequent points updates and things like that. But I think to some extent you just like, you just can't keep up with the number of data sheets in an army, and you can't make them all viable. And for the most part, a lot of them are just going to be worthless. So having a slimmer codex is actually, is good, because then suddenly you don't have to worry about all this garbage that you're not going to play or whatever. Generally, I think that the question isn't, how many data sheets a codex has. When looking at their like flexibility as a faction, I think it's how many useful data sheets they have. And if you have a small number of data sheets, then you have a higher percentage of those being played widely. And so I think that's a much more important kind of metric to define a codex by. So I don't think the faction having a low number of data sheets is bad, and I do hope that we sort of see a trim down or an amalgamation of data sheets in the future where they've already started to do this with like war gear options. The old Chaos Space Marine Codex, every different power weapon profile was like a different thing. You could have a maul, or you could have an axe, or you could have a sword, and those were all just rolled into one profile. They're all just accursed weapons now. And I hope that we see similar things like that. And I know, like, as cool as it is to have like 4 different varieties of Deathwing Terminator, like we could probably just make them one data sheet and then like, give them a different war gear option or something, like to differentiate a knight versus a command Terminator versus a regular guy versus a relic Terminator. Like, we don't need all those.
Exactly. Oh man, yeah, no, it's crazy. While we're talking, I'm actually glancing at my Space Marine Codex up on the bookshelf, and yeah, the thickness of it compared to the Chaos Demons book right beside it is staggering.
Oh yeah. If you ever want to like kill your computer, like go to Wahapedia and go to the Space Marine entry, like where they collate the data sheets and they have them all listed, and then just like have the ones for every single chapter there too, because it's like it tries to load like hundreds of pages of data all at once, and it's real bad.
That's amazing. It's like a RAM test for a computer, basically.
It absolutely is. Yeah. You ever want to check your internet connection? That's one cool trick.
Oh man, that's really funny. An idea that I had for a while that I thought they were going to do. I thought that like in my spicier takes that Primaris would be its own codex and Firstborn would be its own codex, because like there's enough models to just split that friggin' book in half. It's really funny.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it feels like at some point, like there's gonna be a shakeup. Maybe it's 11th edition or something where either Primaris take over and they're just that's all you can play now. Like they just squat they legend the front stuff or something,
right,
which I'm sure everyone would throw a hissy fit about. Or they just say that a Space Marine's a Space Marine. It's just like, you can take a tactical squad and either it's 10 Primaris guys or it's 10 Firstborn guys. They're the same. Yeah. They're the same profile. Like it doesn't. The difference right now is one attack, and you can use transhuman physiology. Like, do you really need 2 data sheets for that?
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's a very, very good point. Yeah, I think there's a convergence on the horizon here where a Space Marine is a Space Marine.
Right.
So.
Yeah. I would love to see that. That would make the Space Marine Codex much more
palatable.
Yeah, palatable.
Yeah. Oh man, good stuff. Well, hey, yeah, I think that's everything that I had in my kind of surveying of your knowledge pool for those that want to take a dip in the competitive side of things. Is there anything else that has maybe sprouted up since we've been talking?
Yeah, I know we glossed over a little bit when we wanted to talk about like new players getting into competitive play, and how there is sort of like there are like sort of rules of thumb around playing competitively, and using chess clocks and taking tape backs and stuff like that. And I think that, like I said at that stage of the discussion, I think I'd like to reiterate that a lot of the time people are everyone's just here to have fun and play toy soldiers, and I think that there is there's like a perception that, playing this kind of loosey-goosey game of 40k where sometimes your rules are wrong and you allow takebacks and stuff like that is like sort of is never done in competitive play, or is is frowned upon in the competitive community, and that's absolutely not the case. And I think I'd like to sort of reiterate that for the most part, people are just here to have a good time. If somebody's trying to beat you, generally speaking, they want to beat you because they're better than you, not because like you forgot to declare a banners action or something like at the start of your turn instead of two phases in.
Absolutely.
And so I think that you'll find that the competitive community is actually full of sweet people. So just come to an RTT sometime and check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. The spirit of the game that we all love is alive and well in the competitive scene is what I feel that you're reiterating there.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure.
Awesome. Well, hey man, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a fun time.
Absolutely. All right. So that's going to do it for us here on the 5x5 podcast with Slam Sector. But we've got new content coming out all the time. Coming over the next week or so, we've got some more no dice plays where we're playing through some 40k games, and then every Monday we have a fun old live stream bat rep. Remember, if you enjoyed what you heard today, to like this episode, subscribe if you want to get updated with new episodes, and check us out on our socials at Slam Sector on Twitter and TikTok, and at Slam Sector on Instagram. And if you'd like to participate in the discussion, join us on Discord at discord.gg/Slam Sector. Thanks for listening. My name is Matt. And this has been Trevy with TacticalTortoise. And if you want to say again where folks can find you, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, sure. You can find all my channels over at tactical-tortoise.com. And that will get you links to everything. I mostly upload on YouTube. That's where most of my stuff goes. I do a weekly live stream show on Tuesdays over on the YouTube channel. And then usually you'll find probably 4 or 5 pieces of content a week for me. And then I stream generally about every other weekday over on Twitch at twitch.tv/TacticalTortoiseTV. So if you want Warhammer content, I got a couple. I got a little bit for you.
Hell yeah. All right. What do you usually stream?
So either it's stuff on Tabletop Simulator. So I run a competitive TTS league called T5S2. That stands for the Tactical Tortoise Tabletop Simulator Tournament Series. And I will commentate games from that, or just be playing games in that. And then also some Warhammer related other stuff. So video games and, painting and things like that. Less painting. I'm on a Dark Tide kick right now. So if you like Dark Tide, I may literally go stream that immediately after this call. Not that the viewers will be able to catch that stream, but I'm sure if you follow me on Twitch, you'll be able to get one of them one of these days.
Absolutely. Well, hey, man, I might immediately watch you play Dark Tide then.
Hell yeah.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks again for coming on the podcast, and thank you for listening. This is Matt from Slam Sector signing off.